Lucas had no intention of spending the night in his car. The plan was simple: a night out with friends in downtown St. Louis, hopping from one bar to another, soaking in the city's vibrant nightlife. He had started the evening with just a drink or two, but as the night wore on, he lost track of how many rounds they had gone through. It wasn't until he stood up to leave that the full extent of his intoxication hit him. The world tilted, and he knew he was too drunk to drive home safely. The idea of spending money on a hotel or navigating the hassle of finding an Uber back to the suburbs seemed too overwhelming. In his hazy state, Lucas made a decision. He would sleep it off in his car. He found a small parking lot near the riverfront. It was mostly empty, with just a few other cars scattered about. It seemed quiet enough, and more importantly, it felt safe, at least at first. His old sedan wasn't exactly a haven of comfort, but Lucas was too drunk to care. He retrieved a worn-out sweatshirt from the trunk and bundled it up to use as a makeshift pillow. The back seat was cramped, and the leather was cold against his skin, but he figured it would do for a few hours. Cracking the windows just enough to let in some air, he settled in. Above him, the streetlights flickered, casting an eerie, sporadic glow over the lot. Despite the discomfort, exhaustion soon overtook him, and he drifted into an uneasy sleep. Sometime later, Lucas wasn't sure how long, a tapping sound jolted him awake. At first he was disoriented, the fog of sleep still clouding his mind. His initial thought was that a cop had found him and was about to lecture him on the dangers of sleeping in his car. But as he squinted through the darkness, he realized this wasn't a police officer. Instead, a shadowy figure stood just outside his window, barely illuminated by the flickering streetlights. The person wore a hoodie, the fabric obscuring their face, and they were standing far too close to the car for comfort. Lucas's heart began to race. He tried to stay calm, thinking that if he ignored the stranger, they might go away. But the figure didn't leave. Instead, they started to move, slowly circling the car, their fingers dragging along the glass. The scraping sound was barely audible, but it sent chills down Lucas's spine. The figure paused at the driver's side door, and Lucas heard the unmistakable sound of the handle being tested. Relief washed over him when he realized he had locked the doors earlier. The figure then moved to the back window, where Lucas was lying down. The person pressed their face against the glass, peering in at him. Lucas could make out the shadowy outline of their features, but the darkness kept the face hidden. The eyes, though, he could feel them staring directly at him. Lucas held his breath, not daring to move, praying that the person would lose interest and leave. Time seemed to stretch out each second, feeling like an eternity. Finally, the figure stepped back from the window, but Lucas couldn't hear any footsteps retreating. He lay there, paralyzed by fear, trying to muster the courage to move. After what felt like forever, he slowly sat up and glanced through the windshield. His heart nearly stopped. The figure was still there, now standing about 10 feet in front of the car, just staring at him, motionless. Panic surged through Lucas. He didn't even remember grabbing his keys, but suddenly they were in his trembling hands. With a quick twist, he started the engine. The headlights flicked on, and as soon as they did, the figure bolted, disappearing into the shadows of the night. Lucas didn't wait to see where they went. He slammed the car into drive and sped out of the lot, his heart racing as fast as the engine. He didn't stop until he reached a brightly lit gas station on the other side of town. There, he parked under the glare of the fluorescent lights, keeping the doors locked and the engine running. He sat there for the rest of the night, eyes wide open, every nerve on edge, waiting for morning to finally arrive. Even the next day, the terror hadn't fully subsided. As he drove home, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that he was still being watched. Every time he passed through that part of town in the weeks and months that followed, he found himself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that shadowy figure lurking somewhere in the distance, waiting for another chance to strike. Story Counter, to the night I couldn't sleep. It was one of those nights where sleep seemed impossible. The clock on the nightstand read 6 a.m., and the world outside was still draped in the soft early morning darkness. I tossed and turned, my mind restless, so I decided to turn on Family Guy. It's a comfort show for me, something familiar and light-hearted to distract from the eerie quiet of the night. I don't even remember drifting off, but I must have at some point. You see, I have POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, which sometimes causes me to pass out unexpectedly, and that's exactly what happened. I got out of bed, but before I could take a step, I felt the world tilt and fade away. I hit the floor, and that's when things took a turn. I couldn't see much, it was too dark, but I was aware of a presence, someone, or something, dragging me. The sensation was faint, like I was only half conscious, yet it was strong enough to shake me awake, just not enough to keep me there. I slipped back into that hazy in-between state, terrified but unable to fully grasp what was happening. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy with fear. I texted my mom, telling her I was scared and had no idea what was going on. The moments after that were a blur, but I started to calm down, convincing myself that maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I sent another message, telling her she didn't need to come to my room. But then I heard it, a soft knock on my door. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the knocking persisted, growing more insistent. I tried to reassure her. "It's fine, Mom. You don't have to be here." But the knocking didn't stop. My heart raced as the door slowly creaked open, just a crack. My eyes widened in the dim light as I saw something slip through the narrow gap, a balloon. My birthday had been a few days ago, and the balloon must have been from the celebration. I stared at the balloon, watching in horror as it wedged itself through the door. The door continued to open, inch by inch, revealing more of my mom, or at least that's what I thought. I only made it to her shoulder before I jolted awake, gasping for breath. I glanced at the clock again. It was still early, and the house was silent, too silent. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. Closed my eyes, trying to shake off the lingering fear, but then I heard it. Voices, my brother and sister talking loudly, almost yelling. The noise was deafening, echoing in my ears, but when I opened my eyes, the voices stopped. I closed them again, and the voices returned, louder this time, relentless. It was like they were right there, beside me. But when I looked around, I was alone. The realization that they weren't awake, that they hadn't been awake for hours, sent a chill down my spine. I needed to drown out the voices, to make them stop. I'm not someone who sleeps with the TV on, or any lights for that matter, but I was desperate. I turned Family Guy back on, cranking up the volume until it was almost too loud. Gradually, the voices faded, becoming distant echoes until I could barely hear them at all. My body, still trembling with fear, finally relaxed enough to let me fall asleep. Even now, I can't shake the memory of that night. It was one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had, and the worst part is, it felt so real. I wasn't entirely asleep. I kept opening and closing my eyes, caught in a nightmarish limbo between wakefulness and sleep. As someone who lives in the Appalachian Mountains, I can't help but wonder if it was something, or someone, trying to get me to open that door. The thought still sends shivers down my spine. Even though it was just a dream, it's a night I won't soon forget. Story 3. There's something in my auntie's house. When I was younger, my aunt's house was a second home to me, nestled in a quiet town far from the bustling streets of London where my cousins lived. It was a place filled with warmth, laughter, and the comfort of family. My cousins would often come up to visit, and together we'd fill the house with the noise and chaos that only children can create. But beneath the familiar comfort of that house, there was something else, something that even as a child I could sense lurking in the corners, watching silently from the shadows. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was just a kid, after all, more interested in playing games and exploring the nearby woods than paying attention to the strange, unsettling feeling that sometimes crept up on me when I was alone in a room. But there were moments, small, inexplicable things, that stayed with me, even though I tried to push them to the back of my mind. One time, I was supposed to join my mom on a visit to my aunt's house, but I was too sick to go. I stayed home, disappointed to miss out on seeing my cousins, but otherwise not too bothered. When my mom returned later that day, I could tell something was off. She tried to act normal, talking to my dad in low, hushed tones, as if to keep me from hearing. But I was a curious kid, and I couldn't help but listen in from the next room. What I overheard sent a chill down my spine. My mum was recounting a story, her voice shaky with unease. She told my dad that while they were all sitting in the living room, my mum, my aunt, and my older cousin, my cousin suddenly went pale. She stared at my aunt, her eyes wide with fear, before saying something that seemed ripped straight out of a horror movie. "Who's that little girl standing next to you?" My aunt froze. There was no little girl. It was just the three of them in the room. My cousin insisted, her voice trembling as she pointed to the spot beside my aunt. My mum and aunt exchanged nervous glances, neither of them knowing what to say or do. My mum tried to reassure my cousin, but the damage was done. The atmosphere in the room had shifted, thick with an unseen presence that none of them could explain. That was the first time I heard about the strange occurrences in my aunt's house. But it wasn't the last, not by a long shot. Another time I was sitting on the stairs while my mum and aunt chatted in the kitchen. Their laughter echoed softly through the house, a comforting sound that made me feel safe. The stairs were a favorite spot of mine, high enough to let me hear everything going on in the house, but tucked away just enough that I could disappear from view if I wanted to. As I sat there, swinging my legs and daydreaming, I saw my mum walk from the kitchen to the living room, but something stopped her in her tracks. As she passed the stairs, she glanced up and saw a figure move at the top. It was just a fleeting glimpse, but enough to make her gasp. I saw her freeze, her eyes wide as she stared up the stairs, her breath catching in her throat. There was only one problem. It was just the three of us in the house. My mum, my aunt, and me. No one else. My mum looked at me, her face pale, and then turned back to my aunt. "Is anyone else here?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. My aunt shook her head, confusion and fear mingling on her face. My mum didn't say anything else, but I could see the unease in her eyes. She tried to shrug it off to keep things normal, but I knew she was scared. Years later, when I asked her about that moment, she admitted that she had been terrified, but didn't want to frighten me. The last time something happened was when my brother and I had to spend the night at my aunt's house while our parents were away. It was supposed to be fun, a mini adventure with just the two of us. But as night fell, the house seemed to change. The friendly, familiar rooms took on a darker, more sinister edge, and every creak of the floorboards or rustle of the curtains set my nerves on edge. We tried to sleep, but the unease kept us awake, so we did what any scared kids would do. We talked. We whispered about everything and nothing, trying to distract ourselves from the growing tension in the air. At some point, during our conversation, we heard it. A soft, sharp shh, like someone trying to hush us. We both froze, our words dying in our throats. It was so close, as if someone was standing right beside us, whispering in our ears. We immediately thought it was our uncle, trying to get us to quiet down. But as I lay there, the pieces didn't fit. My uncle and aunt were sleeping on the complete opposite side of the house, far from where we were. The sound had come from much closer, too close. We didn't speak of it again that night, but the thought has haunted me ever since. Looking back, I realized that these incidents weren't isolated. They were part of a larger pattern, a series of strange occurrences that pointed to something unexplainable lurking in my aunt's house. As I grew older, I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that it was just my imagination, that there were logical explanations for everything. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something in that house, something beyond our understanding. And it was watching us. Even now, as an adult, the memories of those nights linger at the back of my mind, resurfacing when I least expect them. The house still stands, and my aunt still lives there. But I can't bring myself to visit as often as I used to. The warmth and comfort of that place have been overshadowed by the inexplicable, by the lingering presence of something unseen. And though I've tried to move on, I know that I'll never truly forget the feeling of being watched by something I couldn't see, something that didn't belong in our world. Story 4. I often remember that night and wonder what really happened. I was between 10 and 14 when it happened. The exact age doesn't matter, but the memory is vivid, imprinted in my mind as one of those nights you never quite forget. The house where I grew up was a bit strange. A single-story home with an odd layout. My room, which was really an extra living room, was tucked away on one side of the house, separated from the other rooms by a long hallway. It was closer to the driveway than any other part of the house, almost isolated in its own little corner. The driveway was long and looped around in a small circle that led from the road to the backyard. My room had windows on three sides, one facing the road, two on the right wall overlooking the circle pavement in the backyard, and one on the left wall with a door that led directly outside. The left side also had another door that opened into the kitchen and living room, but those rooms were on the opposite side of the house. Across the road from our house was a factory, a looming presence that added to the eerie feel of the place. The house had a reputation within the family. My older brother claimed he saw ghosts, two of them, and my parents believed him. He'd tell us stories about how they'd mess with him, making his nights sleepless. My little brother had his own strange encounter. One day, my mom asked him to put some clothes away in his room. The lights were off, and as he bent down to open a drawer, he saw a pair of black shoes standing beside him. He looked up and saw a man in a black hat with a face so dark it was like looking into a void. Terrified, he ran to my mom, but she didn't believe him. The room where this happened? It was the same one where my older brother had his ghostly encounters. Despite all this, I usually slept with the lights off. It wasn't a big deal until that night. I woke up in the dark, which was normal, but something felt off. I was scared, lying there in the room that felt so far away from the rest of the house. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for my phone, always within arm's reach in case something happened. I didn't know what was about to unfold. A few seconds after waking, I heard it, a metallic scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the pavement right outside my door. The sound started at the beginning of the right wall, near where the circle pavement began, and slowly moved toward the driveway. I froze, too terrified to even breathe, let alone move. My mind raced, trying to process what I was hearing. Was it an animal? Someone playing a prank? But then the laughter started. It was an evil, guttural laugh, the kind you hear in horror movies, except this was real. The sound continued to move along the wall, scraping and laughing as it went. My imagination ran wild, conjuring images of a monstrous figure dragging a shovel or something worse along the concrete, laughing as it got closer. I wanted to peek out the window, but I couldn't move. The thought of looking out and seeing something horrifying staring back at me kept me paralyzed with fear. The sound reached the windows facing the driveway, and I knew whatever it was right there, just feet away from where I lay, hidden under my blankets. The laughter grew louder, more sinister, and then something even stranger happened. The air around me began to vibrate. It was a low, humming vibration, almost like a portal opening up, though I know how ridiculous that sounds. But in that moment, I truly believed that something otherworldly was happening right outside my room. The vibration intensified, shaking the walls, the windows, even the floor beneath me. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a feeling, a deep, unsettling vibration that seemed to come from another realm. The laughter continued, blending with the vibration, filling the room with a sense of dread that I can't fully explain. My mind struggled to make sense of it, to come up with a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. I thought about the factory across the street, wondering if it was something from there, but I'd never heard anything like it before, and I never did again. Just as suddenly as it started, the vibration and the laughter stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I lay there, still frozen, too scared to move or even close my eyes. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell back asleep, though I don't know how. The next morning, I asked my parents if they had been outside the night before. They looked at me like I was crazy and said no, they hadn't left the house. I knew what I had heard. I knew it wasn't a dream. But there was no explanation, no rational reason for what happened that night. It was as if something beyond our world had visited my little corner of the house, something that didn't belong. Years have passed since that night, but the memory hasn't faded. I often find myself thinking about it, replaying the sounds, the laughter, the vibration in my mind, trying to make sense of it, but I can't. There are things in this world that we can't explain, things that defy logic and reason. That night, I believe I encountered one of those things. I know this isn't the scariest story, but it's real. It happened to me, and I'll never forget it. Every now and then, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear that laughter in my mind, and I remember that night. I wonder what really happened, and I can't help but believe that there's so much more to this world than we can ever understand. Story 5. What was in my dream? Was I even dreaming? It was late, around 2 a.m., and I was lying in bed at my friend's house, which was deep in the countryside, far from town. His place had a weird vibe, not your usual sketchy area, but one that had stories of witchcraft and even a known cult nearby. The house had always given me an odd feeling, but that night something happened that I still can't fully explain. It scared me to the point that I wasn't sure what was real anymore. I was exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open, teetering on the edge of sleep but still somewhat aware of my surroundings. As I drifted in and out of consciousness, I was suddenly startled by a scratching sound at the window. Now, this is where things get confusing. I can't tell you if I was awake or dreaming, but everything felt real. The TV was on, casting a dim light in the room, the air conditioner hummed, and I could see everything clearly. It was my friend's room, but for some reason, in my sleepy state, I thought it was my own room, and the scratching was my cat trying to get in. The sound wasn't just scratching. It was accompanied by something that sounded like a bear trying to meow. But instead of getting up, I ignored it, thinking my cat was just being needy. I rolled over, trying to fall asleep again, but the scratching and the strange noise persisted. Still, I didn't move. I figured I'd let my cat in later, assuming she'd get bored and go away. But then the scratching stopped, replaced by a loud, insistent banging. I woke up again, at least I think I did, annoyed but not scared, still convinced this was my room and that it was just my cat outside. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the banging that was growing more intense, like someone or something was trying to break in. As the banging grew more aggressive, something even more disturbing happened. The noise at the window began to speak. It wasn't a normal voice, but a slow, scratchy imitation of one. It was like something was trying to mimic human speech but couldn't quite get it right. It called my name. Emily, let me in. Let me in, Emily. The words were drawn out, eerie, and somehow it didn't scare me. I was still half asleep, my mind struggling to process what was happening, and for some reason I was convinced it was still my cat, though deep down I knew it couldn't be. The voice kept repeating, "Let me in." And then it started asking for something. "Are you going to give it to me, Emily? Let me have it. Give it to me. Let me in." I had no idea what it was talking about, and I was so confused. It felt like I was on the verge of speaking back, trying to figure out what it wanted from me. I don't know why, but I almost said, "I was, but not now." Something inside me, though, stopped me from saying anything, as if my instincts were telling me that engaging with whatever was outside was a bad idea. By now, minutes had passed. The banging and the demands grew louder and more violent, as if a grown man was trying to tear the window off the wall. The voice, still slow and distorted, became more desperate, more forceful. "Emily, let me in. You said you'd give it to me. Will you still give it to me now?" It didn't sound human anymore, and the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't my cat. This wasn't my room. And whatever was out there wasn't anything I wanted to let inside. And yet I was still weirdly calm, lying there, half asleep, half awake, trying to make sense of it all. The noises were so loud, so aggressive. Like the whole wall was being ripped apart. I finally decided I needed to let the cat in before it wrecked something, like the air conditioner. But the moment I sat up in bed, everything changed. It was as if I suddenly snapped awake for real. The room was darker, quieter. The banging, the voice, everything was gone, replaced by the hum of the fan and the air conditioner. My friend was next to me, breathing softly, and I finally realized where I was. This wasn't my room. There was no cat outside, no back door to let her in. Fear washed over me as I lay there, now fully aware of how strange the whole experience had been. I sat there for what felt like forever, listening, trying to make sense of it. The room was still, and the fear in my chest only grew. Was it a dream? It hadn't felt like one. I never woke up, never had that moment of realization that I had been sleeping. It was as if 1 minute I was hearing all those noises, and the next, everything went dark and quiet. Eventually, I lay back down, pulling the blanket up to my chin, staring at the cup on the nightstand. I didn't sleep for a long time, too scared to close my eyes. But eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. I couldn't have been asleep for more than 5 minutes when a scream tore through the silence. It wasn't human, but it wasn't an animal either. It was something in between, a noise so gut-wrenching that it jolted me awake, except I wasn't really awake. The room was pitch black, and I couldn't move. My arms and legs were frozen, and the only thing I could do was try to look around and breathe. The room was quiet, except for the slow creaking of the floor by the TV and a small click, like someone turning the TV off. For a moment, I thought it was my friend getting up to check on something, and I started to relax. But then I heard the noise again, this time from the window. It wasn't banging anymore, but a low, painful crying. It didn't sound human, but it was trying to. The sound was deep, scratchy, and it echoed in the stillness of the room. My heart sank. This was different from before. This noise didn't just scare me, it terrified me to the core. I could barely breathe, frozen in place. As I lay there, too scared to move, I felt my friend roll over beside me, his arm brushing against me. That touch snapped me out of my paralysis. My eyes shot open, and suddenly I could move again. I sat up, ripping the blanket off, and looked around the room. The TV was still on, the familiar Roku screen bouncing around, and when I turned to look out the window, there was nothing there. No sound, no light, nothing. I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, too terrified to close my eyes. The sun eventually came up, and only then did I finally drift off to sleep, exhausted and confused. The next morning, I told my friend about what had happened. He looked at me, worried, and said he hadn't heard a single thing all night. That was strange, especially since he mentioned that his mother had engraved Bible scriptures all along the base of the house and blessed all the doors and windows. He suggested that maybe something was trying to get in, something his mom had been trying to keep out, and for some reason it had targeted me. That happened just last night, and I can't shake the feeling that someone or something is watching me. All day, I've been paranoid, unable to understand what that experience meant or what I should do next. What was in my dream? Was I even dreaming? I don't know, and that's what scares me the most.